Chapter 2. Sic Semper Plebibus. Command spaced an empty casket. They'd have had a better time justifying that to the crew had Seven's remains been truly irretrievable. If the body had caramelized to the conduit and couldn't be removed without damaging the ship, well, sometimes that happened. But Command opted not to retrieve the body because it would have put them behind schedule. They'd have had to shut down the star drive to allow it to cool enough to handle her remains. The captain agonized over the decision. Publicly. It was required viewing on the monitors, before ultimately declaring that neither time nor tide waited for any man, and ordered them forward towards their next destination, which just so happened to be a Monomax, the pleasure world where half the officer corps were in danger of losing non-refundable reservations. So they draped a flag over an empty box, the cost of both deducted from Seven's final payout to her family, and shot her off into space. Caskets were normally fired out of a torpedo tube with the crew gathered in the lounge to watch it pass. But with the starboard torpedo bay shredded, they'd have had to take their other main battery offline, a risk Sivos, their unsmiling security chief, was not about to approve. So the cargo bay it was. The captain hadn't attended. Neither had any of the officers. The regular no-shows, that is. Winesboro, the science officer, was there, though he never looked up from his datapad, and Sivos was present as always. He had to be anywhere that many red shirts were gathered, and a lot of red shirts were there, far more than could have been packed into the lounge. The unassigned crew were housed there in the cargo bay, in rows of tents that they had to rent at a cost almost as great as a quad berth. Most of them hadn't known Seven. For the unassigned, the only way into a quad was when someone got brigged or died. They knew the risks, and the morbid turnover rate. Still, they volunteered in swarms. Service was the only way off the toxic sonic that used to be the Earth. They volunteered, racked up massive debts in training, and arrived in cargo bays in the fleet in droves. And that's where they stayed, an unassigned, highly trained, highly indebted labor pool sitting in tents in the cargo bay, subsisting on meal pellets and accruing more debt while waiting for an opportunity to start working, knowing full well that any such opportunity came over the steaming corpse of someone just like them. And yet, fabbing anything to ease the tension or pass the time, especially food, would get you brigged faster than if you'd suggested unionizing. The funeral's first speaker had been an Armstrong. He spent his time praising the captain, marveling over Seagrave's quick thinking and pragmatism that had saved the day yet again. He only brought up Seven to say how happy, nay, how proud, she must have been to give her life for the ship. That's what they'd all sign up for, he reminded them. The captain's hologram appeared at the podium to deliver one of his pre-gen homilies. The red shirts muttered the words of his speech along with his recording. Blah, blah, duty. Blah, blah, character. Now is not the time to politicize this tragedy, but to come together as a ship. And remember, the captain and his disposable crew said together, true heroes are those who give their lives to something greater than themselves. His image turned the wrong way. Had the funeral been the lounge, he'd have been looking out over the torpedo battery and addressed the wall. As we commit the earthly remains of our beloved crewmate, his image froze. Senior Technician Mary Chevalier, said the ship. To the vast depths of space, resumed the captain, grant her inner peace and tranquility until the day when Senior Technician Mary Chevalier and all who believe in you will be raised to the glory of new life promised in the waters of baptism. We ask this through the mercy of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen, said the cogs flanking the hologram. The captain flickered and vanished, leaving the crew to meander back to their stations. Webb hadn't spoken to anyone after the ceremony, or back at the quad. It was quiet there now, and seeing it empty, she was struck by how truly tiny it was. By how uncomfortable its bunks were. They capped the women's beds at 1.6 meters to save space. Webb had to contort herself to fit and still wound up cracking her head a couple of times a night. By how the shower unit at the back timed your water consumption and charged you every minute you went over. If you fell behind in your payments, it would just shut the water off. By how they removed the food ports from the quads when the crew had started hacking them to fab items not on the menu. Now they had to retrieve their food from the mess, where your transactions could be properly monitored. By how this little tin box had been her home for over a decade, and how 100 women in the cargo bay were waiting for her to die. The naked eye observation stations resembled the belly gunner turrets on those ancient warplanes. The ship didn't need them, and the crew didn't staff them, but as much as engineering wanted to shave them off and seal the hole, they were forbidden from touching them. They were a mandated throwback to the earliest days of starfaring, when a moth's fart could knock out the sensors and you had to rely on crew with telescopes floating in zero gravity to see what was out there. The fleet's current sensors could brush the edge of a galaxy and were more reliable than the sun. But the Neos remained, obsolete as the internal combustion engine. The contractors who built them in gerrymandered districts back home had their reps howl at the brass every time they tried phasing them out. As a result, every vessel leaving the Coalition shipyards looked like it had a bad case of boils. If you needed a quiet place to disappear to, though, you could hardly do better than a Neos. They offered spectacular panoramic views. Whenever the ship settled in orbit, the planet-side stations became popular retreats and makeout spots. They were a bit like parks in that way. But when the ship was off in the vast, as the Independence was now, its Neos network lay empty. It was one thing to look down on a world from the vantage point of a god. Quite another to stare off into infinity, dwelling upon your own insignificance and how your friend is dead. Webb sat there in the dark, clutching a frozen pizza, blaring power metal at ear-bleeding volume. She was probably doing irreparable damage to her ears, but what the hell? The Coalition would give her new ones. At a crippling interest rate, sure, but it's not like she was ever getting out of debt anyway. She resisted the urge to slap herself. What the hell was she doing thinking about finances when another quadmate was gone? No, not gone. Baked into the circuitry because the officers couldn't be bothered to delay their boner sessions. Prospective woman. A tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Frankie shouting her name. Webb turned the music down. Sorry, helps me think. Also drowns out the comm badge ads. Those played at regular intervals when you weren't on duty, and sometimes when you were. Frankie settled into the seat beside her. I don't know how you can concentrate with that. It's not so much about concentration as annihilating thought. Does it work? I hardly hear it anymore, but yeah. When I need to not be in my head, I put on the classics. I don't know that I would consider Powerwolf the classics. That's Nightwish. Philistine. Frankie eyed the pizza. Is this where you keep them? In the lining. Webb rapped on the rim of the Neos's tiny airlock. Vacuum of space makes a pretty good freezer. She could hardly feel her hands. Frankie noticed. Gloves, maybe? Thought some real food would help. The crew, you know. 7 was popular. She drummed numbed fingers on frozen cheese. Lost my appetite, though. Indy, that's enough. Cut the music. You'll be charged for the full hour, said the ship. Fine. Silence fell. The quadmates stared out into the universe. Years ago, back when Webb was less desensitized to fatalities, this was about the time Frankie would offer to sit with her, to meditate, discuss, listen if she needed to rant, rave, or whatever. It's how they'd met, in the support group Frankie ran, where Webb had been sentenced after the shuttle incident. The inner peace Frankie promised never materialized. A friendship had, along with a respect for boundaries staked out around old wounds, the caution tape around pain. So Frankie waited. Webb felt tears rise up, briny and sour, to catch in her eyes. That's as far as she could allow them. Any farther and the dam would burst, and there was no safe place for that. Break down in the wrong spot, and a cog would drag you to the infirmary, where they'd pump you full of serum and pills until those unproductive thoughts dissolved along with your personality and libido. The libido going wouldn't be so bad, though. It's not like she was using hers. She chuckled. And it would be nice to see the doctor again. I don't want a ship anymore. Webb waited for a reply, queued up counter-arguments for what she expected Frankie to say. Probably some variation of, "What's changed?" Or a reminder of how she always says that. Frankie just nodded. Okay. I'm serious. It's different this time. Frankie didn't nod. Didn't disagree. She just waited. And watched. The quiet little bitch. I'm not kidding, said Webb. I'm done this time. For real. I'm leaving all this bullshit behind, and damn it, why won't you contradict me? It makes sense, said Frankie. Why would you still want your own ship? I don't. I get it. Who would, though, huh? Who'd want to run a ship for an organization that does nothing but stake mineral claims and terraform rocks to sell to settlers? Frankie didn't reply. But that's how you pay for space travel, Webb said for her. I know that. Like that's the greatest calling of humankind, finding more shit to sell to each other. It's not bad enough we used up our own planet. We've got to strip bare everything else we find? Uninhabited world, sure, but fuck! She stared out the transparent triluminium dome. We know they're out there. The Sorrel, the Kixelpick, the Ord. We are not alone. The ultimate question, the one that maddened us for centuries, answered, and on a scale no one could have guessed. And somehow joining that great society has not become our main pursuit. What is wrong with us? Frankie looked amused now. Webb considered slapping her. Not hard, just enough to knock some words loose. No time for that. She was on a roll. We trade with them. We host their ambassadors. Hell, people get xenoglyph tattoos that they think are espousing some profound alien truth, but probably just means soup. You know, I've heard you can get work out there. As a contract freighter, shuttle pilot, some xenos are willing to hire humans. They find us novel. Anyway, there's just so much more out there we don't even know we don't know. Just worlds of cultures and shit, and we're not exploring because it's not profitable. And I just, Christ, what a waste. We finally got off the planet, but we brought our worst shit with us. Webb's comm badge chimed. Your next lung payment is due, said the ship. But now is the perfect time to refinance. With offers starting at the low interest rate of... Webb slapped it off, sighed, stared off into the infinity at her fingertips. I want my own ship. There you are, said Frankie. Never gonna happen, though. You can't know that. Shut up, Frank. I thought you wanted me to talk. The future hasn't been written and the past is gone, but most people still figure out a way to live in one of the two. You are who you are now, at this moment, unbound either by the setbacks of your past or your expectations of what's to come. And that person has achievable goals and a performance review tonight. Webb blinked. Lord, totally slipped my mind. Dewey thought it might have. She asked me to remind you. While we're on the subject of reviews, Webb shifted in her seat. I'm not ready for the hearing. Same goddamn result, just you watch. Most likely. They won't find cause for a trial. Probably not. So why even do the dance? You're asking like I have the answer. Webb reconsidered slapping her. What would you do? And don't say meditate. I won't then. It just never took for me, you know? I can't just be. I figure things best out by doing them. While doing them often. You want my advice? There's gotta be a better way of getting out of your head than deafening yourself. Hit the gym. Go to the arcade. Do what Chelsea and Rob do whenever they get a free minute. Webb snorted. That's a 2-person gig. If you haven't noticed, I'm a body short. About that, Frankie dug a data stick out of her pocket. Here. Seven used to fire this up when she needed some time out. Webb raised an eyebrow. Is this an arcade scenario? One of her romance novels. Come on, Frank, those are banned. And with good cause. They're dumb, certainly, but enjoyable under the right circumstances. And tacky as hell. You can customize your partner, said Frankie. They've got whole banks of images if you want to reskin the sprite. Maybe you could model him after a certain doctor. Webb flushed. I cannot believe you're advocating for this. Hey, I practice non-attachment, and this is strings-free. It's also safe, 0 chance of disease or pregnancy. And the best part, if you tell him to stop talking, he actually shuts up. Webb eyed her flatly. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Or so I've heard. Frankie slipped it into Webb's pocket. The door to the corridor rolled back. A soldier with the visor down poked their head in. Webb didn't know which to hide first, the pizza or the data stick. She settled on the stick. Chelsea lifted her visor. Hi. She checked the corridor. I reported my comm not working, so I have about 5 minutes. She tossed a red-wrapped parcel to Frankie. I didn't see that contraband. Webb stashed the pizza away as Chelsea clambered between them. The Neos was a cozy fit for 2, with 3, and one of those in blast armor. They were squeezed like too many books on a shelf. Chelsea pulled off her helmet, dumped some data sticks into Webb's hand. 7s? Chelsea nodded. She wanted them spiced. Did you already? Another nod. Streamed her data to her mom. Security frequency. They don't check those for bereavement violations. Soldiery had its privileges. Frankie unwrapped the parcel. Inside were the contents of 7's locker. Books, pictures, assorted ephemera, all tied together in her spare uniform. Coalition policy was to ship the effects of dead crew back to their families at enormous cost. So enormous that most of the crew hoped their quad mates would space their belongings to spare their families the hit. Chels held up a dense ball with a heavy seam down the center. "The hell's this?" "Cricket ball," said Webb. "We played half an inning the last time the arcade had a sale. She scored so many runs I never even got to bat." The quaddies retied Seven's uniform around her belongings, slipped it into the airlock, and waited for the latch to read secure. "Mary Chevalier," said Webb, "we commit your remains to the stars." She opened the lock. The package drifted out and unfurled, spilling Seven's personality out into the tides of the cosmos, along with a shimmering, frozen disk. Chels pointed at it. "Wasn't that your pizza?" Webb blinked, slumped. "God damn it." Any officer-involved crew death automatically triggered a review hearing. On average, that meant 1 or 2 a week. For a junior officer, their immediate supervisor was supposed to oversee the proceedings. For a senior officer, such as Lieutenant Blackwell, the captain himself would preside. Webb took her seat in the crew gallery. Aside from the men in violet below, the officer section was empty. Winesboro was there, his face still anchored to his data pad. Webb wondered if he knew the funeral was over. She wouldn't have been surprised if a cog had carried him here. Sivos was also there, his gaze already distant. It was his duty to escort any officers found liable to the brig to await trial. He'd never had to break out the cuffs, and based on his body language, he didn't expect to today. Webb's section, the upper deck reserved for the enlisted crew, was packed tighter than a sardine tin. Her contingent was supposedly composed of the finest members of the crew, individuals renowned for their merit and civic virtue. All of them, to a man, and they were all men, had been hand-picked by their commanding officers. On a totally unrelated note, no officer had ever been found liable for the death of a crewman, a fact the officer corps trumpeted as part of its safety record. The crew reps were all Armstrongs, a sub-faction of redshirts who revered the officers, informed on the crew, and who were usually left in charge. Narcs. All of them. The rest of the crew called them officers in red, something the Armstrongs didn't take as a slight. Why would they? They all expected to be officers themselves someday, despite promotions out of the enlisted ranks being vanishingly rare, and defended the officers like they were protecting an investment. The Armstrongs were easy to identify, even without the undeserved swagger. They all wore those stupid secondary badges, technically a uniform violation, of an inverted drop of blood over the moon, a reminder of all the good men who died taming space. Caelum nostrum, their badges proclaimed. Space is ours. A much bolder motto than the one on the red shirts' badges. Alius ascendet, another shall rise, usually from the cargo bay. The Armstrongs got the easiest shifts and completed their advancement requirements at duty stations rather than on away missions, which meant they were rarely in harm's way, which meant they never died, which meant there was almost zero turnover rate in crew representation. The Armstrongs made up of maybe 10% of the crew, but over 90% of the panel. Webb, the panel's only crew-elected representative, and the only one without a blood drop badge, represented 5% of the vote. The cog by the stand broke stasis to tap its comm badge. "All rise." Everyone except Winesboro stood. "The incident review panel of the Starship Independence is now in session," it intoned. "Captain William Seagrave presiding. Be seated." Everyone sat, except for Sivos, who resumed his bored pacing. The captain's chair was empty, Webb noticed. She tapped her badge. The cog turned towards the balcony. "Technician, will the captain be attending?" "He's not feeling well," Blackwell told the cog. "He sends his regards." "In light of the captain's absence," said the cog, "we shall defer to the highest present authority, the Independence herself." The cog's head shuddered and dropped only to rise again just as quickly. "Calling the inquiry into the incident involving crew person 10507, the cog said in the ship's voice. "The Justice Chair will initiate the proceedings." An Armstrong at the rail smoothed both his hair and uniform as he stood.
"Jack Jacobs, if it please the court. Hey, LC, dig the new pips."
He made snap-guns at Blackwell. Blackwell nodded back.
"All right."
Jacobs turned to the crew contingent.
"Let's see if we can't wrap this up early and get out of here. I've got a hot date or 3 waiting in the arcade."
The Armstrongs chuckled.
"Okay, somber face. Look, as with any crew fatality, we are shocked and saddened by this senseless tragedy. Our hearts and prayers go out to the family of the deceased and her mates at her duty station. It's easy to savor your anger and hunt for someone to blame in these circumstances. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we're all alive right now because of the captain. And because Lieutenant Commander Blackwell's quick thinking gave him the insight he needed to save the ship.
Nods and grunts from the Armstrongs. Webb raised her hand. Jacob's smile drooped. Yes? Did I hear that right? Lieutenant Commander? I was promoted. Blackwell sat up straighter. For meritorious conduct.
In saving the ship,
added Jacobs. Webb sucked her teeth. I love a fair trial.
So,
Jacobs clapped his hands.
Unless there's any compelling reason to keep us here, the crew panel finds no cause to indict. Move to absolve. Officers?
Winesboro raised his thumb but not his eyes. Sivos made a face but didn't speak.
Officers approve. Crew?
A chorus of ayes as the Armstrongs stood.
All opposed?
Nay. A battalion of two similar faces turned to glare at Webb. Jacobs shook his head.
I guess we're doing this. Fun.
Are we going to have any testimony? Asked Webb.
The committee's spoken, said Jacobs. It's unanimous?
Not quite. Sighs and hisses from the Armstrongs. The half that were already out of their seats plopped back down. Jacob's smile was strained.
The captain would prefer a unanimous decision. He wouldn't want the lieutenant commander's promotion tarnished because the crew rep is holding a grudge. You know, you and the deceased were close.
Quaddies, said an Armstrong. If that's true, you should recuse yourself, said Blackwell. Webb looked around Jacobs to the cog. May I address the defendant? There is no defendant, the ship said through the cog. Lieutenant Commander Blackwell is not on trial. The subject, then. She picked her way to the front of the gallery and stared at Jacobs until he moved. Lieutenant Commander, why were we in the atmosphere? Blackwell regarded her with professional disinterest. That's classified. That may be so, but planned maneuvers typically aren't. The crew needs time to prepare, and according to the logs, skimming Atmo wasn't on our schedule. Unless it's official policy now to make environmental maneuvers without alerting the crew? I've answered the question, said Blackwell. Isn't it true that only the captain could have ordered us onto—
I'm sorry,
interrupted Jacobs, who clearly wasn't.
But where exactly is this going?
Please keep your inquiries relevant to the incident involving service member 10507, said the ship. She has a name, said Webb. And Chevalier's death was the direct result of having to manually patch a vein after the ship lost power, which itself was a direct result of an unscheduled, unprepared dip into Atmo. One the captain ordered without properly alerting the— Excuse me. Blackwell's face tightened. Are you blaming the captain? The captain is not on trial, said the ship. No, Blackwell shushed the cog. No, I want to hear this. Clearly you have some evidence, or you'd never level such an accusation. Webb could feel Jacob's stare burning into her back. The loss of power was caused by a catastrophic failure after an explosion in the starboard torpedo bay. Jacobs threw up his hands.
Wow, there we go. If it's anyone's fault, it's the torpedo crews. Why are we even talking about this?
Good question, and one I'm not qualified to answer. She turned to the cog. Indy, I would like to call torpedo technicians Sandoval and Waratini to testify. Denied. Webb blinked. Her mouth felt dry. Whatever for? They are in the brig. Without trial? They were tried and found guilty, said Indy. I presided. What exactly were the charges? That is classified. Jacobs leaned into Webb's field of view.
Yeah, so the brigged don't get to testify against law-abiding members of the crew because of how they're criminals? Where exactly are you going with this?
She gripped the rail to avoid punching him. Isn't it obvious? Negligence. The Armstrongs snorted and started talking among themselves. One mimed jawing with his hands at Webb. Shut up, Sivos bellowed over the comms. This is a serious accusation. The captain is not on trial, spat Blackwell. He kept the loss of life to a minimum, to 1. You could have sent in a cog, said Webb. The surge wouldn't have killed it. That's true, Winesboro said without looking up. Well, depending on the voltage. You could have repaired it or replaced it, but no, you sent in a body, and now Chevalier's gone forever.
Replaced it?
Jacob's smirk could have split his face. His eyes said, "I've got you."
And how, pray tell, would we have replaced it? How exactly? You were going to say fathing. You were, weren't you?
Armstrongs were all looking her way. Same with the officers, even Winesboro. Bunk it. She had the floor and a platform any crew member could watch. In times of crisis, the Coalition allows emergency fabrication of critical equipment so long as the costs are covered at interest once the crisis has passed. The jeering was so loud she couldn't hear herself finish.
Sure, said Jacobs. And let's just torpedo the whole economy while we're at it.
Webb rolled her eyes. Are you that bunking dense? Language, warned Blackwell.
We have the technology to turn energy into matter, said Webb. We have a star drive that provides a nigh infinite energy. So why exactly is fabrication illegal if it could save crew lives? I don't know, said Jacobs. Jobs, maybe? You've heard of those?
Which we don't need when we can create matter at will. Blackwell chuckled like an amused professor. As much as I'd enjoy debating basic economic theory with a technician, is this in any way related to your questions about the atmosphere or torpedo bay? Or are you just taking a moment to shill for a thoroughly discredited agenda? The Armstrongs whooped and applauded. Webb felt the tears rising again, briny and hot. No, not happening here. She narrowed her eyes. Chevalier is dead because the captain damaged the ship and refused to use a replaceable machine to fix the problem. And now my friend is dead.
Just vote, said Jacobs.
You're going to vote against me, aren't you? A muscle in Blackwell's jaw twitched. For something I had nothing to do with. Damage to the ship and equipment comes out of the officer's lay of profits, said Webb. You'd rather spend our lives than risk your income. I've said what I came to say. I abstain.
Wow, what a protest, said Jacobs. Vote carries with one abstention. Absolved?
Absolved, said the ship. You are free to go, Lieutenant Commander. Not just yet, said Blackwell. I want that technician censured for verbal abuse. Webb couldn't even summon the energy to scoff. Are you even serious? Lifeless white eyes swung her way. Senior Technician Weber, you are hereby under censure. Your sentence is 60 hours extra duty. Lurd. And another 20 for vulgarity, said Blackwell. Webb dropped into a seat. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Jacobs whispering into his Armstrong pin. Blackwell smiled. I like that. He rose, tugged his uniform taut. Technician, seeing as how your grandstanding cost your peers their reservations at the arcade, I think it's only fair you clean it out when they're done. The advent of nearly limitless power, coupled with the technology to convert energy into matter, had mutated entertainment into an unrecognizable new experience. The ship's various arcades tapped the star drive to create immersive fantasy worlds indistinguishable from reality. The arcade could put you anywhere, at any era, in any situation, with anyone. If you could imagine it, the arcade could bring a nearly perfect approximation of it to life. A dream, any dream, come true. But unlike any dream, you could touch it. Images in a scenario stayed intangible until they came in contact with a guest, at which point angled force fields sprung up to create resistance and texture and weight. And for guests, as long as contact was maintained, the grass running through their fingers was as real as the hands touching them. Customizable reality, indistinguishable from the real thing. It was immediately co-opted for porn. The downside of the arcade was the downside of any fantasy. When it was time to wake up, the dream world faded, but anything organic left behind by the guests remained, sometimes in glazed layers. The arcade had an auto-sanitizer, but it had been permanently disabled, not because anything was wrong with it. The autoscrub got the axe because one of the most disheartening forms of punishment on the ship was cleaning up after someone else's humpfest. Webb scrubbed the floor of the arcade with pissed-off determination and a toothbrush. She shouldn't have gone off during the hearing, like she hadn't known what the result would have been. Bastard Armstrongs didn't even consider themselves red shirts, just temporarily embarrassed officers. She hadn't done herself any favors this close to her own performance review, Accusing the captain of negligence would come back to bite her. Cleanup didn't take that long. This wasn't her first trip to the spunk box, but she couldn't leave. They locked her inside until her off-duty hours were over, and with the arcade shut down for punitive measures, she couldn't boot up anything better. When it wasn't spinning a fantasy, the arcade was downright ominous, all harsh angles and deep shadows. Webb needed a shower. She wouldn't have a chance for one until after her performance review. She considered hacking the arcade to run a scenario, any scenario, so long as it had a decent bathroom. She couldn't think of one that did. She dug Seven's data stick out of her pocket. Arcade porn had never been Webb's thing. She'd never even been curious. But Frankie had called it a romance novel, and most third-party scenarios were designed to get around the arcade's restrictions. Maybe there's a shower in the setting. The arcade was locked offline for the duration of Webb's punishment, but you don't get to senior technician without a few workarounds in your pocket. She set the arcade on a phantom diagnostic cycle, made sure the door was locked, loaded the scenario to the main hollow emitter, and double-checked that the door was locked. "Impresario," she told the room. "Load the program on the data stick." Indy chimed a warning. "Unsanctioned scenario detected." "Override," said Webb. "Authorization code Dewey, Barbara, KSD-9118. The arcade's brutalist contours dissolved into pastoral hills. Hedgerows adorned with roses sprung up, conveniently arranged to keep her in the center of the room. She followed the hedge's vanishing lines toward an old European manor with ivy climbing a castle-like tower. The place looked cozy and inviting. It also looked like it didn't have indoor plumbing. No shower for her. She was about to pull the plug when she heard a whinny, turned, and spotted a manly paragon riding her way. He was gorgeous, market-testedly so, his face carved from a block of solid handsome. He reined his horse to a stop beside her, his open shirt rippling in the wind. He smelled of leather and wood smoke and autumn apples. The arcade's pheromone subroutines must be working overtime. With a sigh, he turned piercing blue eyes her way. Webb felt a flutter. Whoever programmed this had read a few of those novels. "Forgive me," he rumbled in a pleasant baritone, "but when my game warden reported a trespasser, I never expected to find one so lovely. What business have you here?" "Hey," Webb gave him a tiny wave. "I don't suppose you've got a shower in that pile of rocks back there?" He threw his head back and laughed, his perfect hair streaming in the wind. "Ha ha ha ha! So forward! I must inquire, what family would raise a daughter to be so bold in the presence of her laird?" No, don't tell me. I'm keen to guess." "Look, is this part skippable? I'm really only interested in the shower." "Surely you know me, the widowed laird of this manor." He gazed off towards the pain in his backstory. "How lonely my home has been since fate took her away from me." "Please!" He thrust out his arm. "Do not bring her up again." "I didn't say anything." "I shall speak of it no more." "Okay." "Careful!" he bellowed. "You'll startle him." Webb blinked. "Who?" The nobleman didn't move. Webb pointed toward the horse. "Did you mean that?" The moment she moved, the horse performed a completely scripted action, rearing and stamping down in a convenient puddle. Mud spattered Webb's dress. Webb also noted she was wearing a dress. The nobleman chided his horse. "Och, forgive me, dear lady. Casanova only rears when he fears I am in danger of being hurt. Clearly he is mistaken. For what pain could you inflict upon me greater than what I have already suffered?" His gaze went distant again. A single tear welled in his eye. "I shall speak of it no more." "Jesus," said Webb. "Spring for a writer next time." "Your dress," said the nobleman. "You are sodden. You must accompany me back to the manor. I shall have my handmaidens draw you a hot bath and launder your clothes." "You had me at bath," said Webb. "Wait, you have handmaidens? Are they naughty?" He nodded gravely. "Persistently so." The sky turned crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon. Webb was pretty sure it had been noon a minute ago. She regarded the sprite. He was far better looking than she'd expected. Whoever programmed this had put an amazing attention to detail. And it had been quite a while since her last dive between the sheets. But he was way too pallid for her taste. "Impresario, what are the customization options for this character?" "You may choose from the bank of pre-generated skins or customize individual features," said the arcade. "Full customization averages 3.6 hours. "Ugh, no thanks. I'd probably get caught before that." "What are the pre-gens drawn from?" Historical figures and celebrities. Well, she glanced at the frozen nobleman, considered who to overlay him with. There was this one guy. What was his name? Her sister had a poster of him in high school. 21st century movie star. Something Elbow. Ignis? Ignis Elbow? That didn't seem right. She snapped her fingers. Idris Elba. Have you got him? The nobleman refreshed with a ripple. Now his locks were leonine and more salt than pepper. He gazed upon her with mahogany eyes and a forest wood face. Webb's heart still skipped a beat. Oh, shit, yeah. Okay, resume program. It is late, my lady, cooed Idris in a voice distilled from honey and sex. Too late to return to your village. I fear the wolves prowl at night. For your own safety, you must accompany me back to the manor. I insist. He extended his hand. Webb's pulse quickened. She scoffed at herself. This was ridiculous, and motioned for him to lower his hand. Okay, so I haven't really decided if I'm into this, or if this is tacky or not, so as tempting as a bath sounds, and anything that might follow it. My lady, he recoiled aghast. Never would I dream of taking advantage. Although the only room large enough for the bathtub is my bedchamber, and my study is nearby. But never would I inadvertently traipse in upon... Shut up. What I'm saying is, I'm not entirely sold. What would convince you of my sincerity? He sounded genuine enough. That's not what concerns me, said Webb. I haven't determined the quality of your programming. Are you high-lit or schlock? Come again? Like, is your story an actual good read, or are you just a bodice ripper? He shook his head. You've lost me. As if he'd been programmed to answer out of character, nothing to break the immersion. Let's start simple. Why don't you tell me your name? He straightened in his saddle, framing himself before the setting sun, which had just sprung back up, and threw back his hair. I am Abelhard Mountworthy, heir to the Duchy of Eversex. And we're done, said Webb. Impresario, end program. My lady! He reached for her and was gone, along with his castle and hedgerows and sunset, along with her dress. Webb sighed, waited until her heart stopped pounding, and sat in the corner. She strained her ears. No thump of approaching cogs. The scenario had been undetected. She smiled, chuckled. Damn Frankie had gotten her out of her head all right. At least long enough to set the grief aside for a while. Long enough to prepare her for the performance review in a few hours. Long enough to catch a nap. The floor of the arcade wasn't particularly comfortable, but at least she could fully stretch out.